SmarterMarkets is here at CERAWeek, and I'm joined by David Keith, Founding Faculty Director, Climate Systems Engineering Initiative at the University of Chicago. Thanks for joining us, David.
Thank you. Great to be here.
It's great to have you. And for people who aren't familiar, maybe we could start off. Could you tell us a little bit about what Climate Systems Engineering is?
Yeah, it's a new UChicago idea. I was hired in to kind of make that idea real, but it combines probably two big things. One is what we call sunlight reflection, the idea that humans could deliberately make the Earth a bit more reflective or preserve the reflectivity of the Earth by engineering interventions, which would reduce climate change. And the second is open systems carbon removal, ways to remove carbon from the atmosphere. And then we also work a little bit on glacial engineering. Those are the kind of big topics. And then we do this in an interdisciplinary way.
And when you're here in Houston, the center of the oil and gas industry, how do you find the reception to what you're talking about?
I haven't been here long and I don't come to this conference that much. I mean, I'm Albertan, so I'm used to the oil and gas world. I've done a lot of CCS work over the years and worked closely with oil and gas people. But in general, certainly for sunlight reflection, I don't think there's really much to say one way or the other with the oil and gas industry. This is something that in the end governments will do or not do. And there are a bunch of complicated scientific and governance questions about whether we do it, but it's not an industry. I mean, even if it happens, it won't be an industry because it's so cheap. There's no real industry. For carbon removal, there are a bunch of connections to the industry. Indeed, I founded carbon engineering, one of what I guess became the first carbon removal unicorn. And so that was sold to Oxy. So I've got a bunch of contacts there.
And when you think about, where the carbon capture industry is right now, their carbon markets were very much in the front of people's minds a few years ago. There's been a bit of a drift away from that. How do you see the action on climate change progressing now?
So I divide that into several different pots. Are you talking about carbon capture and storage or just carbon markets?
Let's start with carbon capture and storage.
So carbon capture and storage, I think there was an initial focus. I got involved in the late 90s that was really focused on decarbonizing coal-fired electric power. And that was because renewables seemed too expensive. And in hindsight, that almost completely failed, I think, for maybe three reasons. One was we underestimated the costs of CCS, and two was government didn't push on the kind of some kind of version of a carbon price or incentive on big projects. And most importantly, three, renewables got ridiculously cheap.
Right.
So I'd say CCS kind of 1.0, more or less nothing. I mean, there are some projects, but not much happened. I think if there is a CCS 2.0, I think it's probably mostly cement and other related chemicals. I mean, but cement's a big one. It's several percent of global CO2 emissions, highly concentrated sources that are pretty easy to capture, and there's no real substitute.
And I wanted to ask you about the work you're doing at the University of Chicago, because there's two aspects, right? It's like known for the research and then also for the educating the undergraduates and the next generation of students. Maybe starting with the research, what do you think are the most important areas for us to develop a better understanding right now when it comes to climate?
Well, that's a super big question. I'm focused on climate engineering, on really these two topics, sunlight reflection and open system carbon removal. And I'd say, while I'm a professor, I've spent a lot of time doing practical kind of blue collar work. And I think my focus is to try and use the kind of intellectual high-end part of UChicago and help it do more practical applied work on these topics.
Okay. And when you look at the students, is there how do you train them to do the blue collar type work that's required?
Good question. Give them opportunities. I think people actually realize that is, I think there are people coming into university who understand that there's a certain kind of academic publication loop, especially around certain sort of academic work on energy and climate, that's not that coupled to the practical world. And students often come into it actually wanting to have some practical input. So I think you need to give them opportunities. I think they already want it.
Right. And do you find, for a long time, the oil and gas industry obviously has a lot of engineering talent, a lot of people who are used to systems thinking. Do you see some of that moving into the climate space? Ability to access?
I mean, for sure. I mean, CE's purchase of Oxy's purchase of carbon engineering was one example of that. So, I started that company in 2009. It was just the original investment was $3 million. It was a few people. We went through a bunch of rounds. By the time Oxy bought us, we were about 150 people. And, we had a lot. But we did not and never thought we would have the capacity to actually execute $1 billion build. And Oxy and the big EPC firms do, and that's fantastic. So we're thrilled that they're doing it.
And you mentioned open air capture. What do you think's the most interesting developments in that space right now?
I think the interesting developments are people actually building plants and being able to understand what they might cost in the real world and what works and what doesn't.
And so when you put it all together, what do you think the next few years looks like in your space and where the focus should be?
Well, not for me to say where the focus should be, but I'd say the work on sunlight reflection, which may seem totally obscure and weird to a lot of your listeners, is actually moving extraordinarily quickly. There's much more attention from governments than there was even a couple of years ago. This has been a topic that's not new. We've known about it for half a century, but it's been a taboo. Yet the essential fact appears to be that one could, with quite low cost, reduce some of the key climate risks with not zero, but with understandable side effects that appear to be quantitatively small compared to the benefits, and it's not expensive. So that reality is sinking in, and I'd say people are beginning to think about it quite seriously, mostly behind the scenes. It's not a thing people talk about publicly that much.
And what is, from a practical level, how does sunlight reflection work?
So you would put sulfur dioxide, probably H2S, into the stratosphere from a high-flying aircraft. So you could start with conventional business jets, but you probably end up building a new aircraft, which is surprisingly easy to do. So John Langford did a design study for us using the Rolls-Royce 3007 engines, and you can build an aircraft that would carry the relevant material to 20 kilometers. So I think the bottom line is, in engineering terms, it's not very hard. And the costs are tiny. If you wanted to start ramping up to be cooling the world at an additional 1/10 of a degree every decade, even after 2 decades, you'd be looking at a fleet of well under 100 aircraft moving something that's under 250,000 tons of sulfur a year, which, for comparison, we now pollute 30 million tons of sulfur a year. We used to pollute over 70 in the 80s, and the global traded sulfur market is over 70 million tons now. So 250,000 is a really tiny number.
Right. And you said, it's one of these things that doesn't get spoken about openly, probably because the history of sulfur in the atmosphere has tended to be one that was a negative experience. This is a different application, though.
Well, I think negative is understating it. Sulfur air pollution is the biggest single human environmental killer, period. So we've killed more than 100 million people throughout history from sulfur air pollution. But I don't think that's the principal reason that people haven't wanted to talk about it. I think the principal reason has been fear of what people call moral hazard, the fear that if we do talk about this at all, that somehow attention will go away from emissions cuts. And I think part of the reason why it's more possible to talk about it now, and suddenly you are seeing environmental leaders talk about this and governments begin to consider it seriously, is that we are actually making progress in emissions cuts. My personal guess would be emissions peak in the next couple of years.
And what's driving that? Is it the renewables that you brought up earlier?
Oh, the emissions peak?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's unbelievable build out of renewables, plus, changing structure of populations, the fact that at some level, China's done a bunch of the heavy construction of all the roads and bridges and buildings. There's a bunch of factors. So China looks like it may have peaked now. China's 2025 emissions were down by, I think, 0.3%, and emissions have been, the peak is now already 20-some months behind us.
Right. And so if you thought, I know conferences aren't necessarily your thing, but if you could think about how the conversation at a conference like this might evolve over the next year, what would be a way you would like to see it evolve?
Well, next year, the focus is going to be totally on the energy shock from the war, I think. I think the big question is, to me, is how that energy shock interacts with the gradual build out of solar. And I think the thing that people, I think, still underappreciate is how solar getting cheaper and cheaper will change big energy markets. Because I'm a proud Canadian. I live in Kamloops, Alberta. Canadians like to talk a lot about this, but the reality is that solar is much cheaper in sunny places close to the equator, and particularly in places where there's not that, where you only have a diurnal cycle, but not a big seasonal cycle, because that's where storage is relatively cheap. So if you ask where the cheapest power in the world is going to be, it's going to be in sites like that. And that's quite profound. It really shifts the energy balance and the economic balance. And I think it'll shift the security balance in the long run.
All right. Well, thanks so much for dropping by and talking with us. It was great to catch up.
Thank you.
Take care.